The sound of buzzing clippers filled the courthouse hallway, slicing through the tense silence like a blade. A pair of rough, calloused hands shoved her down into a chair, her body jolting at the sudden aggression. Laughter echoed around her, low and mocking, a cruel symphony of disdain. "You don't get to walk in here like you own the place," the officer sneered, standing over her, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "You people never learn, do you? Think you can just waltz into a federal courthouse like you belong here?" She opened her mouth to protest, but before a single word could escape, fingers dug into her scalp, yanking her head back. Another set of hands grabbed her wrist, twisting it just enough to remind her who was in control. She looked up into the officer's eyes, cold and filled with something that sent a chill down her spine, contempt, power, and the sick satisfaction of putting her in her place. "She looks like trouble," another officer muttered, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Could be hiding something in that hair." The buzz of the clippers grew louder. She felt the vibration before she felt the pain, the sharp pull as her thick, coiled hair was stripped away from her scalp, falling in uneven clumps to the floor. It wasn't just hair, it was identity, dignity, pride. Gone in seconds, stripped away without hesitation, without a single question about who she was. Without a single second of hesitation, they had decided she was beneath them. The laughter grew. The officers watching seemed amused, entertained, as if they had done this before. "She's lucky we don't do worse," one of them chuckled. "Should have known better than to show up looking like that." Her breath came fast, but she refused to let them see her break. She wouldn't give them that. She wouldn't let them know the fire that burned inside her chest, the rage that clawed at her ribs, the sheer force of the humiliation sinking into her bones. But the worst part wasn't the act itself. The worst part was that no one stopped it. Lawyers, clerks, civilians, people who should have known better, just stood there. Watching. Saying nothing. When they were done, the officer took a step back, arms crossed, smirking as if he had accomplished something. "There," he said, brushing loose strands of her hair from his uniform. "Now you look more presentable." Silence followed. Thick, suffocating silence. She stood up slowly, gripping the arms of the chair to steady herself, but she did not break. She gathered her breath, smoothing the fabric of her blazer with deliberate, controlled movements, forcing her heart to slow, forcing herself to own this moment, even as they had tried to strip her of everything. And then, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open. Every officer straightened up. The room beyond was waiting. A judge was about to take their seat for an important hearing, one that these very officers were involved in. And as she walked past them, moving through the doors with an air of quiet, unshakable authority, realization dawned on their faces. The murmurs started. The shifting of feet. The sharp, uncomfortable stares. And then, shock. Because the woman they had just publicly degraded, humiliated, and stripped of dignity was not just another civilian. She was not a suspect. She was not someone they had any authority over. She was the federal judge presiding over their case. And when she took her rightful seat behind the bench, gazing down at them with the weight of unforgiving justice in her eyes, the officer who had held those clippers, the man who had laughed at her, who had touched her, who had stripped her of something sacred, stood frozen in place. The blood drained from his face. His hands twitched at his sides. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Because in that moment, he understood. In that moment, he knew. What happened next would change everything. And it would leave everyone in shock. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in any form. This story is a reflection of the painful realities many Black people face, but also a reminder that justice can and must prevail. To every Black viewer watching this, you are seen, valued, and powerful. Never let anyone diminish your worth. Now, get ready for a mind-blowing story of justice, retribution, and an unforgettable twist. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that matters. Let's begin. The courthouse in Memphis, Tennessee, stood tall and imposing, its stone pillars weathered by time and history. It was a place where justice was meant to be served, where laws were upheld, and where people sought fairness. But for Aisha Carter, justice had always been an illusion, a promise made but rarely kept. She had spent her entire life watching the system fail people who looked like her, watching it bend and break for those with privilege while crushing those without. It was what had driven her into law in the first place. And now, sitting in the back seat of her government-issued black SUV, staring at the grand doors of the federal courthouse, she felt the weight of every moment that had led her here. Aisha had fought for every inch of ground beneath her feet. Born and raised in South Memphis, she had grown up watching her parents work themselves to the bone, her father juggling 2 jobs at a steel factory and her mother cleaning houses in neighborhoods that never welcomed her. They had pushed her to be better, to rise above. And she had. Top of her class at Howard University. A law degree from Columbia. A career built on relentless determination. At just 42 years old, she had become one of the youngest black federal judges in the country. And yet, even now, even after all she had accomplished, she still felt the weight of expectation, of the invisible battle she had been fighting since the day she was born. She adjusted the collar of her navy blue blazer, running a hand over her neatly twisted locks. Today was important, a high-profile case involving police misconduct, one that could set a precedent for future cases of racial injustice. The irony wasn't lost on her. It never was. She stepped out of the SUV, her heels clicking against the concrete as she made her way toward the courthouse entrance. The morning air was thick with humidity, the sky a dull gray as if the city itself knew that today would be heavy. She didn't wear her robe outside the courtroom. It was a habit she had picked up over the years, an attempt to keep a small part of herself separate from the identity that everyone else saw. She was Aisha first, before she was Your Honor. But in moments like this, when eyes lingered on her a little too long, when security took an extra second inspecting her ID, when people automatically assumed she wasn't supposed to be here, she was reminded that the world didn't always see it that way. Inside the courthouse lobby, the energy was tense. Lawyers in pressed suits hurried past, clerks shuffled stacks of files, defendants whispered anxiously to their attorneys. It was a machine, a constant cycle of cases, judgments, and verdicts that never really seemed to change the bigger picture. And standing just past the metal detectors, watching everything unfold with his usual air of smug authority, was Officer Darren Calloway. Calloway had been a cop for nearly 15 years. He was the kind of officer that other cops liked but the public feared. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always wearing a smug half-smile that never quite reached his cold blue eyes, he had built his career on power plays and intimidation. He knew the law well enough to bend it to his will. He knew how to make arrests stick, how to phrase his reports just right so that his word was always the one that mattered. And he hated being questioned. Darren was a man who believed in control. He believed in order, in authority, in making sure people knew their place. And when he saw Aisha walk in, just another black woman in a blazer, looking too comfortable in a place she didn't belong, he saw an opportunity. She didn't look like a judge. She didn't look important. No entourage, no clerk following her with documents, no courtroom staff at her side. Just another face in the sea of people who passed through this building every day. And the moment she stepped past the security checkpoint, he felt entitled to remind her of that. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "You lost, sweetheart." His voice was casual, but the meaning was clear. Aisha didn't even blink. She had heard it all before. She reached into her bag, pulling out her official ID, but before she could hand it over, he grabbed her wrist. Not hard enough to hurt, but enough to make it clear, this wasn't a request. "You don't just walk into a courthouse like this," he continued, his grip tightening. "You people never learn, do you?" The phrase hit differently. She had heard variations of it her entire life. But the way he said it, so casual, so confident, so sure that he had the right to say it to her, sent a slow-burning fire through her chest. "I need you to step aside," she said, keeping her voice even. "I have somewhere to be." But Darren wasn't listening. He had already decided who she was. "You think you can just waltz in here?" He motioned to her hair. "Could be hiding something in that mess." A couple of other officers laughed. It happened too fast for her to react. One moment, she was standing in the middle of the courthouse lobby, the next, she was being forced into a chair. The metallic hum of clippers filled the air. A sharp vibration against her scalp. And then, the first strand fell. The laughter grew louder. She clenched her fists against the white-hot rage climbing up her throat. This wasn't happening. Not here. Not now. Not to her. And yet, it was. More hair hit the ground. She saw it, her identity, her dignity, being stripped away. "Now you look more presentable," Darren muttered, brushing loose strands off his sleeve like they were nothing. The room was silent. And then, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open. Darren straightened up, his smugness unwavering, until he saw who walked through those doors. The realization hit like a freight train. His grip loosened. His smirk faltered. The color drained from his face. Because the woman he had just humiliated in front of an entire courthouse was the judge presiding over his case. And in that moment, he knew, whatever happened next would destroy him. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air, pressing down on every person in that courtroom like an invisible force, making even those who had nothing to do with what had happened shift uncomfortably in their seats. The silence was not just an absence of sound, it was a presence, an unspoken truth that screamed louder than any outburst ever could. No one dared to cough, to move, to even breathe too loudly. Every pair of eyes in that room was trained on one man, Officer Darren Calloway. Darren had walked into this courthouse that morning with the same self-assured arrogance he carried everywhere. He had stood tall, shoulders squared, with the confidence of a man who had always held power. He had strutted through the halls of this building like he owned it, like it was his personal domain where he could decide who deserved respect and who did not. And when he had seen Aisha Carter, a black woman standing alone, dressed in a blazer without any obvious markers of status, he had immediately decided she was beneath him. He hadn't hesitated. Not for a second. The humiliation he had inflicted on her had been instantaneous, effortless, automatic. But now. Now the power had shifted in a way he never could have predicted. Judge Aisha Carter sat behind the elevated bench, the polished wood gleaming under the courtroom's bright lights, her posture straight and unwavering. She was calm, too calm, and that was what made it terrifying. There was no rage in her expression, no visible sign of the humiliation she had endured just moments ago. And yet, there was something in her eyes, a quiet, controlled fury, a sharpened edge of absolute authority, that made Darren's stomach clench in a way it never had before. His throat was dry. His palms, usually steady, felt clammy. His pulse thundered in his ears. The courtroom felt smaller than it had a few minutes ago, the walls closing in, the air somehow heavier. For the first time in his career, Darren Calloway was afraid. Aisha rested her fingertips lightly against the surface of the bench, tapping rhythmically, slowly, with purpose. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but to Darren, it was deafening. It was a countdown. It was deliberate. It was a reminder that she was in complete control now, and he was at her mercy. The room was packed. Lawyers, clerks, interns, officers from Darren's own precinct, all of them had gathered to witness what should have been a standard hearing. But there was nothing standard about what was happening now. They had all seen what happened outside. They had watched and said nothing when Darren had dragged a woman into a chair and stripped away her dignity without hesitation. And now they were watching him squirm, watching him stand there completely exposed, watching as reality sank in. Then, Aisha spoke. And her voice was calm, steady, controlled, dangerous. "Officer Calloway," she said, her tone smooth as glass, each word measured, deliberate, unforgiving, "do you understand where you are right now?" Darren felt his jaw tighten. He had been a cop for 15 years. He had testified in court more times than he could count. He had stood in this exact position before, but never like this. He had always been confident, untouchable, in control. But now, the very seat of power and authority he had abused for years was the thing that was about to crush him. "Yes, Your Honor," he forced out, though his voice sounded different in his own ears. Weaker. Aisha gave a slow nod, but it wasn't approval, it was calculation. "Good," she said. "Then tell me, Officer Calloway, do you also understand the significance of this courtroom? Do you understand that this is a place where justice is meant to be blind, where the law does not make exceptions for personal bias or abuse of power?" Darren swallowed, but his throat felt like sandpaper. He could feel the weight of every single person's gaze on him. "Yes, Your Honor." The pause that followed was excruciating. It stretched so long that he had to fight the urge to shift his stance, to clear his throat, to do something to break the unbearable tension. "And tell me, officer," Aisha continued, her voice carrying a sharpness now, an edge of steel beneath its control, "do you believe in the principle that all individuals, regardless of their race, gender, or status, deserve to be treated with dignity in this courthouse?" Darren knew he was trapped. There was only one acceptable answer. "Of course," he said, his voice too quick, too forced, too empty. Aisha tilted her head slightly, her eyes scanning his face as if she were reading something deeper, something he couldn't hide. Then, she leaned forward slightly, her elbows resting on the bench, her gaze locked onto his like a predator pinning its prey in place. "Then I have to wonder, Officer Calloway," she said slowly, her words precise, "why, just 20 minutes ago, in this very building, you saw fit to publicly humiliate a woman you assumed to be beneath you? Why you felt entitled to violate her dignity in front of an audience, without so much as asking her name?" Darren felt something tighten in his chest. His pulse pounded. His hands itched at his sides. His mind screamed at him to fight back, to regain control, to turn this situation around. His attorney, who had been sitting stiffly beside him, took that moment to intervene, shifting in his seat. "Your Honor, I'd like to," but Aisha raised a hand, silencing him instantly. Her gaze never left Darren's. "You will speak when I allow you to, Counselor," she said, her voice sharp as a blade. The impact was immediate. The weight of what was happening settled heavily over the entire courtroom. The very people who had laughed alongside Darren just minutes ago, who had stood by in silence, were now watching him crumble. She let the silence stretch again, forcing everyone to sit in it, to feel it, to confront it. Then, finally, she spoke. And what she said would be the beginning of his undoing. "I want to be clear about something, Officer Calloway," she said, her voice smooth, almost casual, but carrying the weight of 1,000 unsaid truths. "I am not just some woman you dragged into a chair like an animal. I am not just another black face in a place you believe I don't belong. I am the judge overseeing this courtroom, and I am also the judge overseeing your fate." The words hit like a bomb. Darren felt it deep in his gut. It was suffocating. It was absolute. He had never truly felt powerless before. He had always walked away unscathed. The system had always protected him. But now, the system had a face. And it was her face. And for the first time in his life, Darren Calloway was about to experience what it truly meant to be powerless. Because Aisha Carter wasn't just going to punish him. She was going to destroy him. And she was going to do it by the book. The weight in the courtroom had changed. It wasn't just the lingering tension from earlier, it was something heavier, something irreversible, something that made every person in that room aware that what was about to unfold would not be forgotten. Darren Calloway could feel it in his bones, in the way the walls seemed to close in the way the air felt thicker, pressing against him like an invisible force. He was used to holding the power, to controlling situations, to making people fear him, but now, he was the one suffocating. Judge Aisha Carter sat with an air of composed authority, but there was an undeniable shift in her presence. Her movements were slow, measured, deliberate. She had been waiting for this moment, not just today, not just from the humiliation outside the courtroom, but for years, for every time someone like Darren had taken advantage of his badge, every time a man like him had walked away untouched while people like her suffered in silence. This wasn't just personal, this was justice manifesting itself in real time. Darren's fingers curled into his palms, his mind racing for an escape, a way out, something, anything, that could reverse the inevitable. But he saw it in her eyes. There was no way out. The room remained still, as if no one dared to move, as if even the walls were waiting for the moment to collapse around him. Aisha let the silence stretch, let the discomfort deepen, let him sit in his own impending ruin before she finally spoke. "Officer Calloway, you've been in law enforcement for how long?" Her voice was steady, but sharp, like a blade pressing against skin just enough to draw blood. Darren cleared his throat, his voice suddenly foreign in his own ears. 15 years, Your Honor." 15 years, she repeated, letting the words linger. "That's a long time. Long enough to know how this system works. Long enough to understand what abuse of power looks like." He stiffened. "I uphold the law." A small, almost imperceptible smirk touched her lips. "Do you?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. "Because earlier today, in this very courthouse, you saw a black woman, assumed she had no authority, and proceeded to strip away her dignity in front of an audience. You didn't ask questions. You didn't hesitate. You acted with the confidence of a man who has done this before, who has gotten away with things before. So tell me, Officer Calloway, is that upholding the law?" His lawyer shifted beside him, uneasy, knowing there was no right answer. Darren clenched his jaw. "It was a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding," she echoed, her voice dipping lower, controlled but carrying an edge that made the hair on his arm stand up. "Tell me, officer, what exactly did you misunderstand? Was it the fact that I dared to walk into this building? Was it the way I carried myself? Was it my skin?" The silence that followed was deafening. Darren couldn't answer. Because any answer would be an admission, and he knew it. Aisha's eyes bored into him, and when she spoke again, her voice cut through him like a razor. "You made a decision based on a bias you refused to acknowledge. And in doing so, you committed a crime." The words landed like a bomb. Darren's stomach twisted violently. "A crime?" His lawyer finally spoke, trying to salvage what was left. "Your Honor, let's not be," Aisha raised a hand, stopping him cold. Her tone didn't shift, didn't waver. "I will be." She reached for a folder on her desk, flipping it open with a deliberate slowness that made Darren's heartbeat slam against his ribs. What was in there? How much did she know? She pulled out a single piece of paper, holding it between her fingers. "You see, Officer Calloway, before I ever took this bench today, before you made the biggest mistake of your life, your name was already familiar to me." Darren froze. Aisha tapped the document lightly against the bench, watching him, studying his reaction, letting the dread seep in before she continued. "You have 12 official complaints filed against you over the last 5 years, she said, her voice steady but heavy with meaning. 12 complaints of racially motivated misconduct. 12 times where you used your badge to intimidate, degrade, and abuse your authority over people who looked like me. And you know what's most interesting, Officer Calloway?" Darren's jaw was locked shut, his chest tight, his skin burning. None of those complaints resulted in any disciplinary action. Not a suspension, not a demotion, not even a formal reprimand. She leaned back slightly, tilting her head. "But today. Today, you made a mistake you can't erase. Because this time, you did it to someone who actually has the power to hold you accountable. Darren felt the blood drain from his face. Aisha turned her gaze to the gallery. And because this happened in a federal courthouse, in front of multiple witnesses, in a place that values the integrity of the judicial system, this is no longer a matter of internal review. This is a criminal offense. His stomach dropped. A murmur rippled through the room. Darren's lawyer shot up from his seat. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. It is, Aisha interrupted smoothly. Because for the first time in his career, Officer Calloway is facing the consequences of his actions. Darren could barely breathe. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't how it worked. Aisha let the weight of her words settle before she delivered the final blow. I am officially recommending that you be stripped of your badge, charged with official misconduct, and placed under investigation for civil rights violations. The entire room exploded into whispers. Darren's lawyer was speaking, but Darren didn't hear a word. His mind was blank, his heart pounding too hard, too fast. She wasn't just humiliating him. She was dismantling him. Publicly. Legally. Permanently. Aisha's voice cut through the chaos. You thought you could humiliate me, she said, her tone like cold steel, but the only person walking out of here in disgrace today is you. Darren Calloway had spent years building his power, using his badge as a shield. But today, he was the one being stripped bare. Darren Calloway felt like the air had been ripped from his lungs. The walls of the courtroom that once stood tall and strong around him now felt like they were caving in, suffocating him under the weight of something he had never truly faced before, consequences. His pulse pounded violently in his ears, drowning out the murmur of voices that erupted around him. His lawyer was speaking, words tumbling out in desperate, legal jargon meant to salvage the unsalvageable, but Darren could barely process a single syllable. Aisha Carter sat still, unmoving, unshaken by the chaos unfolding in the room. Her fingers rested lightly on the surface of the bench, and for a moment, she simply watched Darren, her expression unreadable, her gaze piercing. He had seen power before, had held it, had abused it, had weaponized it against others, but never had he seen power like this. The kind of power that didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten, didn't need to demand respect, because it was already absolute. Darren's mouth felt dry, his tongue heavy as if every word he might try to say would betray him. His instincts screamed at him to fight back, to argue, to throw out some defense, any defense, but deep down, in a way that made his stomach twist in sickening knots, he knew there was nothing left to say. His lawyer was still trying, though, his voice tight with barely concealed panic. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is highly irregular. Officer Calloway has been a decorated officer for over 15 years. If there have been complaints filed against him, it is the department's responsibility to investigate those matters internally. This is not the appropriate venue for such accusations. Aisha didn't move, didn't blink. Are you suggesting, she said smoothly, that a federal courtroom is not the appropriate venue to discuss a crime committed inside this courthouse? The lawyer hesitated. Darren could see it, the exact moment he realized there was no ground left to stand on. Aisha leaned back slightly, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for the tension to dig deeper into Darren's skin. Then she spoke again, this time her voice lower, controlled but carrying the weight of something undeniable. Officer Calloway, do you understand the severity of your actions today? Darren swallowed hard. It was, think carefully before you answer, she interrupted, and the sharpness in her voice made the hair on his arms stand on end. Because whatever you say next will be placed on record. Whatever excuse you think you have, whatever justification you think will make this go away, it won't. Not this time. Darren felt it. The finality. The cold, hard truth pressing down on him with relentless force. Aisha didn't let him speak. She had no interest in his excuses, no patience for his cowardice. Do you know what it means to be stripped of your badge? She continued, her voice unwavering. It means every shield you've ever hidden behind disappears. No more automatic respect. No more benefit of the doubt. No more looking the other way. It means when you walk down the street, you are no longer a man of authority, you are just another man. And do you know what kind of man that makes you? Darren's jaw clenched. It makes you a man who has to live with everything you've done. The words sank into him like a blade. She let them settle, let the silence force him to absorb them, and then she continued, her tone now laced with something deeper, something heavier than just the pursuit of justice. Tell me, Officer Calloway, how many people have stood where you stand now? How many have begged for the same mercy you refuse to give? How many lives have you reduced to just another case number? Darren's breathing was shallow, his mind racing, grasping for any way to regain control. But there was nothing left to hold on to. Aisha tilted her head slightly, her voice quieter now, but no less powerful. You thought you had power, she said. You thought you had control. And today, when you saw me, you thought you had the right to strip me of my dignity, just as you have done to so many before me. But tell me, officer, how does it feel now? To be the one exposed? To be the one with everything to lose? Darren couldn't answer. Aisha exhaled slowly, tapping a single finger against the bench, before lifting her eyes to the courtroom once more. Officer Calloway's conduct today was not an isolated incident, she stated firmly. It was the manifestation of a pattern of abuse, of unchecked authority, of a system that has failed to hold him accountable. But that failure ends today. Darren's lawyer shifted again, his voice lower now, his earlier confidence shattered. Your Honor, I would request that my client be placed on administrative leave pending an internal review by the department. No, Aisha said simply. The lawyer stiffened. With all due, no, she repeated, sharper this time, her voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. Officer Calloway will not be placed on administrative leave. He will not be given time to prepare a defense that does not exist. He will not walk out of this courtroom believing that he will somehow, some way, escape what is coming. Because he won't. Darren's stomach dropped. Aisha turned back to him, her eyes locking onto his, and for the first time, her expression shifted, just slightly, just enough to make his skin crawl. You are hereby stripped of your title, your authority, and every protection that came with it, she said. You are to be formally charged with official misconduct, violation of civil rights, and abuse of power. You are to be held without bail until your trial date is set. The room erupted. Murmurs, gasps, whispers, some of shock, some of quiet approval. Darren barely heard any of it. Because his world was crumbling right in front of him. This wasn't just about losing his job. This was about losing everything. His badge was no longer a shield. His name was no longer untouchable. He had spent years bending the law, twisting it in his favor, believing himself to be untouchable. But today, the law had caught up to him. Aisha leaned forward slightly, just enough so that her final words were meant for him and him alone. You thought you were untouchable, she said, her voice soft but heavy with meaning. You thought men like you would never fall. But tell me, Officer Calloway, how does it feel now? Darren couldn't answer. Because for the first time in his life, he was the one with no way out. Darren Calloway sat frozen in his seat, his entire body numb. The room around him was still filled with murmurs, whispers, the occasional gasp of disbelief. He could hear it all, but none of it fully registered. His mind was a storm of fragmented thoughts, each one crashing into the next, unable to settle on any single coherent idea. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent years in this system, learning its ins and outs, bending its rules, making them work for him. He had watched others get caught up in allegations, investigations, scandals, but they had always walked away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. Until now. He felt a sharp pull on his arm, and before he could process what was happening, two uniformed officers were standing beside him. His colleagues. Or at least, they had been. There was no recognition in their eyes, no solidarity, no quiet understanding that he would somehow get through this untouched. There was only duty. And now, for the first time in his life, he was the one being treated like a suspect. Aisha Carter had not moved from her seat. Her expression remained unchanged, her presence just as commanding as before, but there was something deeper in the way she watched him now. It wasn't gloating, wasn't satisfaction, it was finality. She had done what needed to be done. And now, the wheels of justice were moving forward, unstoppable, inevitable. Darren swallowed hard as one of the officers leaned down toward him, his voice low, mechanical, the same voice Darren himself had used on countless others. Stand up. His body refused to move. His legs felt like they weren't his own, like the very weight of what was happening had rooted him to the chair. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. Officer Calloway, the officer said again, sharper this time. Stand up. Darren's lawyer was speaking, his words quick, desperate, but there was no authority behind them. No one was listening. No one was going to save him. With a deep breath, Darren forced himself to rise, his movements slow, deliberate, as if stretching out the last moments of his freedom. This couldn't be real. This was a nightmare, a twisted, surreal punishment that he had never imagined for himself. He had always been the one in control. He had been the one who gave orders, not took them. He had dragged men from their homes, from their cars, from the sidewalk, put them in handcuffs, made them answer for crimes he had already decided they were guilty of. And now? Now, he was standing in the very spot he had put so many others. The cold metal of the cuffs locked around his wrists with a final, unforgiving snap. His breath hitched, his entire body tensing at the feeling. This was wrong. This was so wrong. The courtroom was silent now, all eyes on him, on the spectacle unfolding. The officers moved methodically, their hands firm on his arms as they adjusted the cuffs. He wanted to pull away, to resist, to remind them who he was, who he had been. But none of that mattered anymore. He was nothing now. Aisha watched the scene unfold without flinching. Darren met her eyes, expecting to see satisfaction, victory, something in her gaze that made her feel superior. But there was only resolve. There was no triumph in her expression, no pleasure. Just the look of a woman who had been forced to be strong, who had carried the weight of too much injustice, and who had finally put that weight down. You can't do this, Darren's voice finally broke through the silence, but it wasn't the voice of the man who had walked into this courthouse that morning. It wasn't the voice of the officer who had stood with arrogance and certainty, knowing the system would protect him. This voice was smaller. Weaker. Afraid. Aisha didn't blink. I already have. A ripple ran through him, a deep, cutting realization that there was no undoing this. He had stepped too far, played the game too recklessly, never believing that the system he had relied on to shield him would one day turn against him. His lawyer tried again, voice rising in frustration. Your Honor, this is an overreach. He is a decorated officer with an impeccable record. Aisha's head tilted slightly. 12 complaints. 12 investigations that went nowhere. 12 times he was protected by the very system meant to hold him accountable. If anything, today is not an overreach, it is long overdue. Darren felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He turned his head slightly, scanning the faces in the gallery. There was no sympathy. No quiet reassurance, no familiar smirks or knowing glances that promised a way out. The people who had once looked up to him, who had respected him, now saw him for what he truly was. He had built his entire career on the assumption that power meant never having to answer for his actions. He had controlled every situation, twisted every narrative to serve his own benefit. He had thought himself untouchable. But now, Stripped of his badge, his title, his reputation, what was left? The officers started moving him forward, guiding him toward the side door that would lead him to the holding area. His feet felt heavy, dragging against the floor. Every step felt final. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder, but he couldn't make out a single word. His head was spinning. Then, just as he reached the door, Aisha's voice cut through the noise one last time. "Officer Calloway," she said, and the room fell silent once more. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see her, standing now, her presence towering despite her calm demeanor. "You spent 15 years believing you were above the law," she said. "Let's see how long you last when you're finally held to it." Darren's stomach twisted violently. The door closed behind him. And for the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to be powerless. The moment Darren Calloway stepped through the side door, the air changed. It was colder, heavier, different. He had walked through this passage countless times before, leading suspects down this same hallway, watching as they were processed, watching as they lost everything. But now, he was the one on the other side. Now, every step he took felt foreign, like stepping into a reality he never believed would be his. The officers escorting him didn't speak. There were no words of reassurance, no quiet warnings, no looks of solidarity. They handled him efficiently, impersonally, just as he had handled so many others in the past. His wrists ached against the cold steel of the cuffs, and a dull, growing pressure settled deep in his chest. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow over the walls. Everything felt harsher now. The cold metal of the door handle, the tight grip on his arms, the sharp clack of his shoes against the floor. He wasn't in control. He wasn't giving orders. He was just another man being processed by the system he once manipulated to his advantage. They reached a small holding area, a room with a long metal bench bolted to the floor, a camera mounted high in the corner, watching everything. One of the officers reached for his keys, unlocking the cuffs with a practiced movement, the sharp click of metal unfastening sending a jolt through Darren's entire body. His wrists burned as the circulation rushed back to his hands. He didn't move, didn't flex his fingers, didn't do anything except stand there, because none of it felt real. "Sit down," one of the officers instructed, his voice flat, detached. Darren hesitated. He had never been given an order like that before, not like this. "Now," the officer repeated, firmer this time. His body moved before his mind could register it, and suddenly he was seated, his back pressing against the cold wall, his hands resting awkwardly on his lap. This wasn't happening. One of the officers stepped forward with a clipboard. "You'll be held here until transport is arranged to central booking," he said, flipping through the pages. "You'll be processed like any other detainee. Fingerprints. Mugshot. Medical screening. You know how it works." Darren knew. He knew better than anyone. But hearing it spoken to him, like he was just another case file, just another intake number, sent a sharp wave of nausea rolling through his gut. The officer glanced at him. "You got any injuries you want documented before you're booked?" Darren barely found his voice. "No." "All right." The officer nodded, writing something down before motioning toward the other one. "He's clear for transfer." And then, just like that, they turned and left, the heavy metal door swinging shut behind them. Darren was alone. The silence felt like a weight pressing down on him, suffocating in a way he had never experienced before. He had thrown so many people into rooms just like this. He had left them sitting on these same cold benches, feeling the same helplessness creeping into their bones, watching as their world collapsed around them. But he had never thought, not for a single second, that he would be the one left waiting for his own fate to be decided. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. He could hear muffled voices outside, distant movements, the occasional burst of laughter from somewhere down the hall. The same courthouse sounds he had ignored for years, but now, they felt different. Now, they were the sounds of a world that had locked him out. And then, the door opened. Darren's head snapped up, his heart jumping to his throat, expecting another officer, another order, another step toward the reality that was now his. But instead, it was her. Judge Aisha Carter stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a soft but final click. Darren's entire body tensed. He didn't know what to say. Didn't know what he could say. He had faced angry defendants before, had watched them try to plead, argue, even threaten their way out of consequences. He had mocked them in his mind, certain that their desperation was nothing more than a last, pathetic attempt to escape what they deserved. But now he understood. Aisha stood there for a long moment, just looking at him. Not gloating. Not triumphant. Just, observing. Studying. And that, somehow, was worse than if she had come in with rage in her eyes. "You don't look so sure of yourself anymore, Officer Calloway," she finally said, her voice quiet but carrying enough weight to crush him where he sat. Darren exhaled sharply, shifting uncomfortably. "What are you doing here?" Aisha tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. "Making sure you feel every second of this." His jaw clenched. "I don't need a lecture." She let out a soft chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "A lecture? No, Calloway. That would be too easy." She took a step forward, her heels clicking against the floor, deliberate and slow. "You've spent years taking people's dignity from them. Stripping them down. Making them feel powerless. And you never once thought about what it felt like, did you?" He swallowed hard but said nothing. "You didn't even hesitate," she continued, her tone sharper now. "You didn't stop to think. You saw me and made a decision in seconds. And I wonder, Calloway, how many times have you done that before?" Darren's hands curled into fists on his lap. He wanted to fight back, to defend himself, to find some angle that would turn this around. But there was nothing left to say. Aisha took another step forward, now just a few feet away from him. "The thing is," she said, her voice lowering, "justice doesn't always come in a way we expect. But today, it did. And you finally get to sit in the world you created." Darren felt it. The cold truth settling over him like a second skin, suffocating, inescapable. She let the silence stretch, let him sit in the weight of his own downfall before she finally turned toward the door. Just as she reached it, she paused. "I want you to remember this moment, Calloway," she said, her voice softer now. "I want you to remember what it feels like to have everything taken from you. To realize you are not above the law. Because no matter where you end up, whether it's a cell or the streets, you will never be the same man again." Darren stared at her, his throat tight, his world burning around him. And then, without another word, she was gone. The door shut behind her. And for the first time in his life, Darren Calloway understood what true justice felt like. The door's echo lingered in the small holding cell long after Aisha Carter had left, like the final note of a song Darren Calloway wished he'd never heard. His body still sat rigid against the cold metal bench, his back pressed so hard against the wall that he could feel the unyielding steel in every vertebra of his spine. He tried to breathe evenly, but every inhale felt forced, like his lungs no longer belonged to him. His mind was a war zone of thoughts, fighting for dominance over his reality. He had spent years believing in control, in power, in knowing exactly how to maneuver his way through the system. He had known what to say, how to act, who to align with. And yet, here he was, stripped of every advantage, every ounce of protection, every piece of armor he had worn so comfortably for the last 15 years. This wasn't just a fall. It was a free fall with no bottom in sight. He squeezed his hands into fists, then released them, over and over again, the sensation of the cuffs still burning into his wrists even though they were no longer there. Phantom pain. That's what it was. The lingering ache of something that had once been a part of him but was now gone. Just like his badge. Just like his authority. Just like everything else. The door opened again, and this time, the officers returned. No hesitation, no wasted movement. Darren knew the routine. He had walked others through it so many times he could do it in his sleep. But now. Now the routine was being done to him. Stand up, one of them instructed, the voice cold, detached. Darren hated how automatic his body moved. The programming in him, the years of being the one who issued commands, not the one who followed them, made it feel like his muscles were betraying him. He had told men to stand up more times than he could count, had given the order without a second thought, without ever imagining what it felt like to hear those words as the accused. His movements were stiff, robotic. His legs felt heavier than they should, as if some part of him thought that maybe, if he just didn't move, if he refused to participate in the process, it would stop. But nothing stopped. They walked him through the corridors, each step ringing out in the silence. He could hear the distant hum of voices, the shuffle of papers, the sound of life moving on around him while his life was crumbling. Then, they reached the processing room. Darren had stood in this very room dozens of times. He had watched as other men he had dragged in himself, stood in the exact spot he now occupied. He had seen the way their shoulders tensed, the way their faces hardened, the way some fought back and others just went numb. He had seen it all. What he hadn't seen, what he had never bothered to see, was how it felt. The officer in front of him gestured toward the desk. Take off your belt, your shoes, anything in your pockets. Darren clenched his jaw. Another officer, standing to the side, narrowed his gaze. Did you not hear him, Calloway? He hated how the sound of his own name, spoken with no respect, no deference, nothing but indifference, made something deep in his chest burn. Slowly, he did as he was told. The belt first. Then his shoes. Then the small items he had left, his wallet, his keys, his watch. The officer took them without acknowledgement, placing them in a plastic tray like they were nothing. Like he was nothing. Then came the fingerprints. Darren had pressed men's hands onto this same glass, had watched as their identities were recorded, as their existence was reduced to a set of prints in a database. He had never once thought about what it meant, what it felt like, to see your identity become evidence. His fingers smudged against the scanner, the screen glowing green, confirming his existence. He was now just another entry in the system. Then came the mugshot. Face forward, the officer said. The camera's flash was too bright, too sudden. It felt like a spotlight on his downfall, capturing the exact moment where everything he had built turned to dust. They didn't let him see the photo. But he knew. He knew what it looked like. It looked like defeat. A short time later, he was led back through the corridors, past desks and offices, past people who had once respected him, feared him, listened to him. Some of them stole glances, others didn't bother looking at all. The silence was suffocating. And then, he heard the voice. Officer Calloway. He stopped. His stomach twisted at the familiarity of it. At the weight behind it. He turned. Aisha Carter stood in the hallway, her expression unreadable. There was no satisfaction, no gloating, no cruelty. Just the same unshakable presence that had stripped him of everything in the courtroom. Darren swallowed hard. What do you want? She stepped closer, arms crossed, eyes steady. I want you to understand something. His jaw clenched. I understand plenty, Judge. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Do you? She asked, tilting her head. Because I don't think you do. Not yet. Darren felt his fists tighten. What else is there to understand? You made your point. You got what you wanted. You got to watch me fall. So what else do you need? Aisha didn't move. Didn't react to his bitterness. I didn't do this for me, Calloway. I did this for every person you thought wasn't worth justice. For every name that never made it to a courtroom because people like you made sure they wouldn't. For every moment you abused the power that should have been used to protect, not to control. Darren looked away, his throat burning. I don't need a speech. She exhaled, shaking her head slightly. You still don't get it, she said. You still think this is just about you. His breathing was shallow. He wanted to fight back, to argue, to say something that would shift even the smallest ounce of power back into his hands. But there was nothing. One day, Aisha continued, stepping closer, her voice lower, sharper, when the noise dies down, when the news cycles move on, when the dust settles, and you're left with nothing but yourself, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember what it felt like to have your power ripped away. And I want you to ask yourself, was it worth it? Darren couldn't answer. Because for the first time in his life, he didn't know. Aisha studied his face for a long moment, as if memorizing the exact expression he wore. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. And Darren Calloway? He was left standing there. Alone. With nothing but the echoes of his own mistakes. Months passed. The courtroom that once held the weight of Darren Calloway's downfall moved on, cases continued, verdicts were delivered, and life carried forward as it always did. But for Darren, time no longer worked the way it once had. Each day felt like an eternity, stretching endlessly as he sat in the cold, colorless walls of his prison cell, counting the hours that no longer belonged to him. He had spent years wielding his power like a weapon, dictating the fate of others, deciding in an instant who deserved mercy and who didn't. Now, he was at the mercy of a system he thought would never turn against him. His trial had been brutal. The evidence against him stacked so high that his own defense team had struggled to find a foothold. Surveillance footage, witness testimony, internal complaints resurfacing one after another, each piece of proof and nail sealing the coffin of his former life. His lawyer had begged for a plea deal, but it was too late. No one was willing to protect him anymore. No judge, no commissioner, no department head wanted to be the one who stood up for the cop who had made headlines for all the wrong reasons. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison, official misconduct, violation of civil rights, and abuse of power. The first week inside was the hardest. Darren had spent his entire career throwing men behind bars, locking them away with the cold assurance that they deserved it. Now, he walked those same halls as an inmate. And the worst part? He recognized faces. Faces of men he had arrested, men he had humiliated, men whose lives had been forever altered because of him. They saw him, too. And they didn't forget. There was no badge to hide behind now. No uniform, no authority, no protection. Just the raw, undeniable truth, he was powerless. Every step he took inside that prison was a step into the world he had built for others. The whispers followed him, the stares burned through him, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be truly afraid. But Aisha Carter never thought about Darren anymore. He had once loomed so large, his arrogance, his unchecked authority, his smug confidence, it had all been reduced to nothing more than a lesson. A footnote in the long battle for justice. She had continued her work, presiding over cases that mattered, making sure that her courtroom remained a place where the law wasn't bent to serve the powerful, where those who had been overlooked were finally given the respect they deserved. Her name had been everywhere after Darren's trial, praised by activists, criticized by those who had benefited from silence, hailed as a symbol of change. But she never let it consume her. This had never been about her ego, never about revenge. It had been about setting things right. About making sure that when people walked into a courtroom seeking justice, they found it. One evening, as she left the courthouse, the air crisp with the promise of winter, she saw a familiar face waiting outside, a woman, older, with tired eyes but a soft smile. Mrs. Reynolds. The mother of a young man who had once been in Darren Calloway's custody, a young man who had never made it out of that experience the same. "Judge Carter," the woman said, her voice careful, as if testing whether she even had the right to speak. Aisha stopped. "Mrs. Reynolds. It's good to see you." The woman nodded slowly, her hands gripping the strap of her purse. I wanted to thank you. For what you did. Not just for my son, but for all the others who never got their day in court." Aisha exhaled, the weight of it all pressing against her chest. It shouldn't have taken this long. It shouldn't have taken someone like Calloway falling for people to finally see what's been happening for years. The older woman smiled sadly. Maybe not. But someone had to do it. Someone had to stand up and say enough is enough. And you did. Aisha held the woman's gaze for a long moment before nodding. "We still have a long way to go." Mrs. Reynolds let out a quiet chuckle. "Yeah," she said, shaking her head. "But at least now, people like him know they can fall, too." Aisha watched as the woman walked away, disappearing into the night. Somewhere, in a prison cell, Darren Calloway sat alone, his back against the cold concrete, staring at the ceiling as the echoes of everything he had done filled the silence around him. He had thought himself untouchable. He had thought power meant never having to answer for his actions. He had believed the system would always protect men like him. But he had been wrong. And now, he had a lifetime to sit with that truth. And now, let's talk about justice. For too long, we've seen people in power get away with everything: unchecked authority, abuse, corruption. And for too long, we've been told that nothing will ever change. But today's story proves something different. No one is above justice. No one is untouchable forever. When the system finally turns against those who have manipulated it, when the truth finally comes to light, there is no escaping it. So tell me, what did you take away from this story? How did it make you feel to see power shift? To see someone who had spent their entire life abusing the law finally held accountable? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories with twists, justice, and unforgettable lessons, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that'll leave you thinking long after it's over. Because justice isn't just a story. It's a reckoning.